Hi guys, welcome back to Mike Lyon, SEN Dad. Today we're talking about four characters from film, TV, literature, drama that show why some people don't feel seen, why some people don't fit the mold, but are really interestingly portrayed and really well portrayed and perfectly capture some really interesting feelings and emotions that people in the SEN community sometimes feel, and sometimes people who aren't in the SEN community sometimes feel. You know, those who don't fit in, those who feel like a bit of an outsider. We'll talk about the kind of writing tropes that are used in these pieces of fiction to depict these characters, what these characters represent, and why people want to feel seen and why that matters. There are four characters that are very, very different, but I think have a common theme. They all are outside the mold. Some of them have clear diagnoses, some of them don't, and some of them shouldn't have. But they all can teach us something about representation and all can teach us something about humanity. The first character I want to talk about is one of the most famous characters from fiction who with a diagnosis of ASD or Asperger's syndrome as it was then, Christopher Boone from The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, written by Mark Haddam about 25 years ago now, was also made into a successful play. The play follows the same storyline as the book. Now, Christopher Boone does have an SEN label. He actually goes to an SEN school. Interesting, now he probably would be put into a mainstream school because places at SEN schools are so difficult to come across, because he's very, very capable in a number of ways. He's very, very good at maths. He can communicate quite well. But I think a lot of the interest I have around Christopher isn't so much about him, although it's told from his perspective. It's a very interesting portrayal about someone who has Asperger's syndrome. Some of it, I think, borderlines on the stereotypical, but it's interesting to see how he misunderstands things. There's a really nice scene in it where his dad and his dad's friend are sitting having a drink or whatever. The son comes in and his dad's friend says, "What's 23 times 17?" And Christopher tells him, and and he says, and Christopher asks him, "Is that right?" And the guy laughs and says, "I haven't got a bloody clue." And Christopher doesn't understand that he's kind of taking the mick out of himself, right? And Christopher sees that he's taking the mick out of him. He doesn't quite understand some of those literal things, which is something that people with, state level 1 autism or whatever it's called now might feel. So that I think is interesting, but some of it I think borderlines on stereotype. What I think is much more appealing to me is the analysis of the family. He lives with his father, and spoiler alert, by the way, should have said at the start of the video, it will appear there. No, it won't. And the father, it turns out, is the one who's actually killed the dog. And it also transpires that his mother, whose father tells his son has died, has abandoned the family, gone off with another person who I think did live in the same street as Christopher. And they live in Swindon, which is, for those who don't know, about 70 miles away from London. And they go and move to northwest London to a place called Willesden to try and start a new life. Now, first of all, the dad does something terribly wrong. He kills a dog. It's the woman he kind of runs off to. It's the wife of the person that goes off with his wife, if that makes sense. They break up. It doesn't work out. They're only really with each other because both their partners have run off. And he makes the decision to kill her dog because I think, in his words, she cared more about that bloody dog than she cared about us being him and Christopher. And also the mother leaves, partly because the relationship with her husband is kind of broken down, but also the relationship is struggling because of their desperation to support Christopher. And the father is much more calm around Christopher. He's much more, they seem to have a much stronger bond. And the mother, one, is jealous of that, and two, can't get that bond with her son herself. And she describes one meltdown that Christopher has in a store where he's getting really overwhelmed, really overstimulated, and she can't help him. And that's like the last straw. That's why she feels like she has to leave. And she kind of takes responsibility for it. She says, "I wasn't a very good mother to you, Christopher." She says it in one of her letters. But maybe if you'd been different. No, she was always trying to palm off some of the responsibility onto Christopher, which you can say is right or wrong. You can also say it's understandable. There's a famous Chris Rock quote. I'm not saying it's right. I say it, but I can understand it. It's that kind of thing. And it does really encapsulate the strain and the difficulties that SEN families go through. Both Christopher's mother and father make mistakes. Both of them do things that they really shouldn't do. And Mark Haddam, I think he talked about, because there's a lot of strong language in the book and even the use of the C word. And he talked about how he was surprised that schools, because it was on the curriculum for a long time, it might still be in certain schools, that they were critical of the use of the C word. It's actually a drunk guy on the train who sees Christopher. And he said that school should be more concerned about the mother abandoning the family. He actually used those words. And she does. And the father also kills a dog. So both make big decisions which are wrong, essentially. Big decisions which they probably regret. I think both of them come to regret those decisions. But it does capture how people under stress and people under strain do and say things that they shouldn't do. And there's probably no more stressful situation than dealing with or supporting a young child, a young man with SEN needs. We've all seen that study, I think it's from Boston University, that autistic parents have similar stress levels to army soldiers. And this captures it. And I always think Christopher's dad gets a bit of a bad rep, because he's the one who stays with Christopher as a single father, going into his school, being there for him when he's having a meltdown, helping him in all of his difficulties, going to the school when he's got into a fight or he's done something wrong, doing everything he can to support him. But obviously he does a lot of things that he regrets. Yeah, and this story, I think, really shows that stress can make people do wild things, and we should not be too quick to judge. Yeah, people in our community are often, very keen to say, if you haven't lived our life or had our experiences, then maybe don't say anything. And I can understand that, and I think that maybe applies here. So I think it's a really interesting story, really interesting novel. And if you haven't read it, have a read of it. And it explores the relationship dynamics, family breakdown, family strain, SEN schooling. It's a very, very interesting book. Also inspired, it's got elements of Sherlock Holmes. Curious Incident Dog in the Nighttime, I think, is a homage to a Sherlock Holmes story. So yeah, have a look at it. Now, the next one is also a child of similar age to Christopher. I'm talking about Billy Elliot from the film Billy Elliot. If you haven't seen it, starring Jamie Bell, who's gone on to be a very successful actor. He was fantastic in the film Filth. This is about a family living in Durham during the miners' strike, and Billy's family, are striking. So it's in a very working class community, and a community that is basically not getting paid, and they're not paid anything particularly substantial anyway. And Billy's family are suffering from the trauma of grief. Billy's mother, obviously the wife of the husband, has died. It sounds relatively recently. So he's dealing with a lot, and he struggles in school. His speech sometimes isn't where it maybe should be. He finds sometimes social interactions fairly difficult, although he's got a very, very good friend. And one of the ways he tries to channel that is actually through boxing, which is where a lot of boys from those sorts of communities do channel their anger into. That's why boxing gyms are often cited as being such important places to, teach discipline, to install a sense of self-worth. But he's actually rubbish at boxing. One of the early films, he gets knocked out or knocked down. But he obviously has the outlet through dance, and that is where he kind of feels things make sense. He kind of feels alive. He kind of feels like there's some order that he can make sense of, because he finds the rest of his existence so difficult, because his family are struggling. And I think what's interesting about Billy Elliot is this is one of the reasons I think so many schools have offered trauma-informed practice in their schools. Trauma-informed practice basically is like this idea. It's not necessarily because every child has trauma, but it's this idea that you can't give specific support and explicit support to everyone who has issues. There just isn't the funding, there just isn't the time. And Billy also doesn't fit into particularly an SEN label. I don't think he necessarily has clear SEN from what I can see. Maybe someone will correct me in the comments. And sometimes, because the system has its limitations, I don't think this is done on purpose, by the way, but because the system has its limitations, can't support everyone, Billy kind of goes through the cracks, and he finds dance as an outlet. He's not getting extra support at school. He's not got a lot of extra support at home because his family are so busy, and they're not working at the moment. They don't have much money, and if they would be working, they'd be so busy in a very physically demanding job. And it shows why it's so important that everyone does feel seen, and everyone does feel like they can get some support or some help with dealing with difficult situations. And schools are trying to do that. I should have said it quickly. Trauma-informed practice is this idea in school where it's de-escalation. The police kind of use a similar thing now, I believe, where you try and de-escalate situations. You don't go looking for confrontation. When you do have a confrontation, you try and de-escalate it. It's all about building relationships. I'm not saying it's a perfect system either. A lot of people have problems with it. But the reason why it was introduced to so many schools is to try and cater for pupils like Billy and other pupils who may have difficulties because of things that aren't SEM. And if we don't support those pupils, they kind of fall through the cracks. Now, Billy finds dance, and he's great at it. And he goes and has the last scene is him, that beautiful scene at the end where he dances in the West End. And his dad goes to see him with his brother. And we know the dad and brother weren't massively supportive of him at the start because of gender roles, boys don't dance and all those kind of old-fashioned ideas. But not all kids have that. Not all kids will have that talent. So it's up to all of us to try and provide some sort of system, some sort of support network for all of our kids, particularly children who might fall through the cracks at times. So I think Billy Elliot is a really interesting character. Please check out the film. It's a great film. Got a wonderful soundtrack as well. Very, very British film. Very, very British feeling film. And also tells the interesting story about the kind of miners' strike and that row with Thatcher and how it ended so sadly. And that the tone of that. I remember that scene. There's two brilliant scenes in Billy Elliot. One is when he I shouldn't laugh. This actually probably might get cancelled. He goes into the dance academy to like practice and to do a trial basically. And there's a kid who's really nice, but he's really posh. And Billy can't quite like tell him to get lost politely, so he ends up hitting him, and he hits him for basically being posh. It's quite funny. I shouldn't really laugh, but it shows that he struggles to kind of communicate his needs properly or politely, particularly in an environment where you can see another boy who has all these gifts of oratory. He has all this nice vocabulary, this beautiful voice, this beautiful accent. Yeah, which, and the Durham accent is beautiful, but it hasn't got the same, people don't look at it in the same way, unfortunately. And there's another scene where his father sees him dance right at the end. Beautiful scene, and Billy looks magnificent. He's a huge athlete, like a proper dancer, and someone tells him that your family's here, Billy. So it's a beautiful scene. So, there's a bit as well where he gets into the dance school and he goes to his friends and tells them, oh, Billy got in. But they say, look, we lost the strike. And there's, you can watch documentaries, you can watch films about when the miners had to go back to work. It was tragic. It was hard. It was a sad moment for many people in British history. And I think Billy Elliot tells that story really well. The next one I want to talk about is, I've mentioned this play before, is Translations by Brian Friel, which is a play about rural Ireland during colonialisation when the English came over and they were changing the names on the map from Gaelic to English. Very, very interesting play. It's considered Brian Friel's masterpiece. And a character in it who's very different, who doesn't fit the mold, even in this kind of eccentric Irish community, where one of the other characters is mute, actually. I don't think she's autistic or I don't think she's SEN needs per se, but she can't speak. She can communicate in other ways and her understanding is very good. But it's Jimmy Jack. Jimmy Jack is known as the infant prodigy. He's this kind of drifter, long hair, semi-homeless, goes around with no real connection to anyone really, but he's incredibly clever. He's got this brilliant knowledge of the classics, of the ancient myths, the Greek myths, and at the end of the play he actually thinks he's getting married to a goddess. His last scene is, am I sufficiently godly to marry her? He's very intelligent, but he's delusional. He can't quite tell the difference between reality and fiction, and I think he's supposed to symbolize Irish scholars and Irish intellectuals who, were very intelligent. There were some great Irish writers. They had, the history of Irish writing is incredible, who were maybe ignoring the colonial struggle, who were maybe burying their heads in the sand, or they didn't want to acknowledge it. And he's a very interesting character because he's isolated, he's not really seen, and no one in the community really knows how to help him. Hugh, the teacher, he calls him the infant prodigy, and there's a great scene with those two at the end, and they close the play. And Hugh, who works as a teacher at this school, he kind of looks towards in the distance, and he sees these English soldiers coming, and he knows that colonialism is coming and pain and suffering is coming. But he, the kind of one of the cleverest characters in the play, and not someone who's delusional like Jimmy Jack, he doesn't know how to support Jimmy either. And that again shows that, this is rural Ireland. This is many, many years ago. And we've moved on since. that a lot of people maybe don't get the support. And particularly in adult social care, people with various issues might fall through cracks, might end up not being supported. Again, I'm not saying this is on purpose. I don't think it is. But because systems have flaws, because people don't always know how to get support, because people don't always have the other people around them to bring them to that support. So I think Jimmy Jack is a very, very interesting character. So you haven't had a look at that. Brian Field translations, wonderful, wonderful play. Unfortunately, there's no film of it, I don't think. But there was a version of it actually played in London Theatre about 3 years ago. I'm sure you can get that on YouTube. I will try and put the link in the description. And last one, Stephen, the Irishman from Braveheart, the film Braveheart, starring Mel Gibson, about William Wallace, the Scottish agitator, if you like, the rebel. Now he's the typical wild man, and he comes in wild. Yeah, they don't really trust him, and then they kind of let him into their group. And his first thing is he kills someone who's trying to kill William Wallace. And actually the film is of him tracking what looks like Wallace, and actually he's tracking the other guy who's about to kill him. And he says, once he kills him, he says he's not right in the head. And the whole joke is he's the one who's not right in the head. So the film kind of plays on this idea that Stephen is crazy until that bit where Stephen might be eccentric. Stephen might have issues, but he's loyal and he's a good guy, basically, in this story, which is very good versus evil. You got the Scottish with Hamish, obviously William Wallace and Hamish's father on one side, then you got Longshanks and the English on the other. And he's kind of the holy fool. He's the classic fool archetype because he believes at one point that he hears from God, kind of hearing voices. You might be thinking this sounds a bit schizophrenic, and it might do. And he actually foreshadows the death of Wallace. He says, I spoke to the man upstairs and I'm going to be okay, but you're screwed, basically. Doesn't use the word screwed. And that obviously turns out to be true because obviously William Wallace goes for a brutal execution. And he's one of those characters that I really was drawn to because he was wild, he was different, he didn't fit into the mold, but he was kind of a hero as well. He was kind of loved. Yeah, he was very much part of the rebellion, and he was loved by all the heroes, and he became a kind of hero himself. And I think that's interesting because if people are given the opportunities to shine, if people are given the support, if people are given the teaching, if people are given the help and the love that they need, they can really shine. Yeah, even if they might. I don't think Stephen has necessarily, but even if they do have various SEN needs or they do have various issues, there's stories all around the internet of people who were diagnosed at a young age, parents were worried they wouldn't be able to do this and that. And some doctors used to actually say that when they gave diagnosis years ago. You can watch the Sylvester Stallone talk show where his son was diagnosed with autism and basically the doctor says, you won't be able to do this, you want me to do this. And that maybe had its place at the time, but there's stories now all over the internet of people who had that experience and are now flourishing or doing very, very well, or talking when they weren't able to talk at 4 or 5 years old, or writing when they couldn't hold a pen at 4 or 5 years old. Yeah. And there's more and more stories like that, and we're seeing more and more stories like that because of the help and the love and the support and the research of all the people in these communities, the SEN community, the community for mental health. And I just thought these characters captured that well. Okay, so if you enjoyed what you see today, thank you for watching, like and subscribe.